Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel YNR Daily Spoiler. Victor exposed. Nikki finds proof of his darkest secret.
The USB that broke Nikki, Victor's darkest crimes revealed before she shoots him. Nikki. Victoria called from the kitchen, making a tiny clatter as she laid down her cup of coffee. Are you okay? Nikki put the envelope inside her cardigan pocket and straightened. She was accustomed to shocks, press releases, and damage management, as well as the Newman's seemingly constant crisis choreography. However, there are surprises in the form of weather, storms that you can see coming, as well as earthquakes. This seemed like an earthquake buzzing beneath the town. I'm fine, Nikki replied. She was fine in the precise, wrinkled way of someone who had spent decades minimizing public anguish. Just a fan letter. Victoria gave her the skeptical expression of a daughter who had seen more behind the scenes than most. At your age, must be a late bloomer. They laughed because laughter brightens spaces and keeps the darkness at bay. Nikki walked the envelope through the Newman Ranch's formal halls, past images of children and marriages that appeared to confirm the validity of family lines. She recalled Victor's mornings at his desk, his strategic glances across boardrooms, and his chuckle, which could sound like an axe or a lullaby, depending on who he charmed. She had loved him in shards, in violent surges, in the way that a woman may love both safety and danger simultaneously. Inside, wrapped like an antique, was a thumb drive with a single printed line. Play me before calling anyone. She waited. The need in her fingers was to call Nick, Victoria, or anyone who could be an anchor. But part of her recognized that certain anchors dragged. Victor was a maze. Once you told him he had been betrayed, he transformed into a different creature, small, precise, and ruthless. There are facts that you can accept and truths that need fleeing a city. She needed to comprehend before inviting others into the tornado. She sealed the study door against the modern world and inserted the drive into her laptop. Files unfolded not as neat folders, but as a slow, clinical confession. Bank statements wired through shell companies, dates stamped during years she remembered as quiet, transcriptions of phone calls in which Victor gave orders, thin, efficient phrases about removing liabilities and making a problem disappear, a video file encoded with a timestamp from a decade ago, and a face she'd hoped to never see again. She replayed that MP4 was one file with one name, and Nikki's throat tightened when she watched it. Victor, younger, hair less gray, voice softened with arrogance, speaking to a dark man in a parking lot. The camera angle was sly. The chat was whisper-heavy about the accident, and keeping her quiet. Victor's hand lay nonchalantly on a car hood, as if the world was spotless and everything, including homicide, was a line in a spreadsheet. Nikki felt her fingers split from her body. She watched the video twice, 3 times, once to confirm her senses, and again because she couldn't believe the man she'd been beside seemed like someone else on a screen commanding another person's life. The proof kept coming. Names on ledgers, developers with ties to Newman's Enterprises, a nursing care that mysteriously collapsed following an anonymous donation, legal files that vanished from public record as quickly as a city wipes a slate clean. The USB didn't just suggest criminality. It painted a map of power that could be wielded like a machete, clearing everything in its path. By the time Nikki reached the end of the thumb drive, a folder labeled Nikki, for when you needed the whole truth, she had a list of formal crimes, as well as a separate list of moral ones, blackmails, threats, and moves that had uprooted people's lives. There was one file in particular, a recorded voicemail labeled with a name Nikki had not realized she had been avoiding for years, Evelyn Hart. Evelyn was a tiny donor who worked in elder care, a woman who had arrived at Newman events with a sparkling smile and once struck Nikki as more steady than other of the city's flashier philanthropists. Evelyn's name had gone from the news pages years ago, after her care home closed under dubious circumstances. The file had a conversation in which Evelyn asked a guy for assistance, and the man responded as if he were ordering a product. This costs us more than I'm willing to spend. The queue then went dead. 2 weeks later, the house was closed, and Evelyn's records vanished. The USB did not state clearly that Victor was murdered. It didn't need to be said. The ramifications, organized with documents and dates, made a case that would keep a district attorney awake. If any of it was true, Victor Newman had used his cash not merely to construct an empire, but also to change the city by removing undesirable residents. Nikki sat for so long that dusk spread across the study, pooling like ink. She looked over the files until her eyes clouded and her palms rang with the steely yeast of panic. Outside, the Newmans' planted lights twinkled like the eyes of a community built on secrets and performances. She recalled all the times she'd wrapped the man in the warmth of her table, the nights of tiny reconciliations, the kindness debates, and the times she'd cajoled him into displaying love at a fundraising event. Neither of those tender moments obliterated the hard evidence on her screen. She heard the key enter the door before he spoke. Victor strolled in like he controlled the world. His tie was slightly loosened, and his laugh lines were deeper from a day of winning. He exuded the ease of someone who feels his life is a play, and performers were always more forgiving than directors, until someone snubbed the script. "You locked yourself in," he added nonchalantly, as if seclusion was a luxury he deserved. "Is everything all right, Nikki?" She didn't respond with fear or surprise. Many of his entrances were accompanied by smaller alarms. "Victor," she whispered, her voice measured as if her blood were a drum. "We need to talk." He sat opposite her, like a man posing for a painting. About. She had to decide whether to reveal him the facts, or to disrupt decades of habits with a small, planned movement. A part of her wanted to watch his face move as she did it, as if she were a scientist watching a hypothesis take shape. Another section of his dreams saw him falling to his knees and confessing, the old man crumbling under the weight of his own mistakes. She selected the direct route. She turned her laptop toward him and opened the folder. Victor watched as the flat image on the screen reflected in the little blue of his iris. He was watching two lives come apart at the seams. The man the world knew and the man the world might see. At first, his fingers beat in a private pattern. There was no immediate denial or deflection. He watched as documents marched like troops into their designated locations. He watched as his own voice, captured on that video, uttered things he would rather have remained silent about. When the video arrived at the parking lot exchange, Victor's face changed, his jaw tightened, and his cordial demeanor slipped to a human line. "Where did you get it?" he inquired, voice controlled, but little in a new way. "You told me to play it before I called anyone," Nikki replied quietly. "Someone put this on my desk because they wanted me to have it, because they thought I should know." Victor leaned back, as if sinking into an armchair after winning a case. "Someone wants to pull us apart," he stated. "Someone is attempting to deprive me of everything because I refuse to give up the keys peacefully. Have you thought about it, Nikki? Maybe this is a smear operation." "But all of this," she replied, pointing to the screen, the ledgers, and the voice recordings that ran through dates and names like ribs. "This is not a smear. This is accounting. This includes financial records, voices, and a video of you." He cut her off, not in anger, but surgically. "You aren't presenting evidence, dear. You are presenting a story that someone has supplied you. Whoever wants to see me fail will use whatever means they can." Nikki felt a hot, unappealing burst of something. Hatred and grief knotted together. "If you are innocent, explain why people are disappearing from your circle. Explain why my calls to a specific care home were unanswered for so long. Please explain why there is a gap in the records where my cousin's donation should have been." Victor's fingers tightened and the flesh blanched. Despite his ability to explain, he maintained a steely resolve in front of the public. Now exposed and cornered in the small private room where love and power previously blended like wine, he grew older and more detached. He moved closer, and his voice lowered to a level appropriate only for the walls. "Nikki," he announced, "you want to spread destruction. You want to dismantle my life in the same way you helped build it. People like us live by making hard decisions. Sometimes that entails making decisions that others can never comprehend. You asked me to be a leader, and leaders must be cruel." Nikki's eyes, on the other hand, were as clear as anything at the bedside. Alertness. There is a difference between a leader and a criminal. His expression stiffened, like an iron mask. "Nikki, don't moralize at me. When you married me, you knew exactly who I was. You loved me for the guy I could be, for my might. Don't act surprised now. Nikki's life had always been marked by a fine line between love and accusation. She recalled her youth, the thrill of emotional devotion to a man who made her feel both safe and insignificant. She remembered the first time the borders of his decisions became apparent, the lines in his face where kindness had been replaced by law. She now saw those lines on a screen, along with their respective names. "You will let this go to the police," she replied, her voice firm and firm. "Or I will." Victor's laughter cut like a razor. "Are you threatening me?" "Nikki, sweetie, I'd expect a temper tantrum or an affair rather than a legal ultimatum." "You sold me your empire on the promise of us," Nikki said quietly, her voice eerily exact. "I'm not going to step away because I'm terrified. I'm stepping away because I'm going to stop you. If they use the law to quiet people, if they, words failed, kill people, I will no longer make excuses." For a heartbeat, the old Victor flickered, a younger guy who'd loved her back but had different cravings. The mask was then folded back into place, revealing the man who was always in control of his own fate. "You don't want to be the one to try to take me down, Nikki," he told her. "You won't like what that costs." She recognized the peril. She understood the man who could use grief as leverage. And in some deep, hidden valley of her heart, she recognized the wrath that had grown over time into a steady, frigid engine. It wasn't just hatred for him. It was the grief of lives scraped to make way for his legacy. It was for the names on the USB and the folks whose names did not appear in the papers. She then exited the study, carrying the laptop as evidence and a small combustible grief. She proceeded down the ranch's meandering corridor, which was lined with images spanning decades and lives, weddings and vacations, and children with cake on their faces. She reflected on how Victor's decisions had shattered the lives of others. Outside, the sky had turned iron gray. She drove to a spot she hadn't seen in years. The small house on the outskirts of town where the Hart family used to congregate, where Evelyn had been kind to a younger Nikki long before the world demanded posture. She parked amid a rain of little lights and entered like a woman about to confront ghosts. Evelyn's daughter answered the door with an angry, weary expression. "Mrs. Newman," she added, using the formal name in a way that prompted Nikki to apologize. "We didn't know if you would come." Nikki showed her the files with unshaken hands. She set them on the table. "I was given this," she explained simply. "I need to know what you know." Evelyn's daughter, Laura, lowered her head into the light like a woman in prayer. She told Nikki about late-night calls, mistransfers, and her mother's hospital room being empty, and then transferred overnight after donors withdrew support due to a questionable audit. She described threats received in the middle of the night. "We will handle this for you," an untraceable voice assured. And then funds arrived that were not registered. "They told my mother she could be quiet for the right price," she said. She refused. Nikki felt something inside detach, like a snapped cable. She had been in a perilous marriage, but the human cost of power was suddenly apparent, not as rumor, but as ledger. When she returned to the ranch, the home felt accusatory. Victor was inside the study. He had the calm composure of a man who was confident he had the last word. He stood up as she arrived, hands folded. "Did you speak with them?" he asked. "Yes," Nikki answered. "And I'll be going to the police." He gave a weak smile and moved at her like a storm with a clean hem. "Call them," he murmured softly, like if she were making a joke. "Call them and explain to them all you found." She didn't want to think about what would happen next, but she had created a script in her head for months. A showdown, indictments, a courtroom, and a public clearing. She had not written about the weight of fear associated with leaving the envelopes and filing public allegations. The Newmans' environment was not easy to break into without falling shards. Victor's hand landed on her arm like a command. "If you take this to the police without knowing the source, you will put yourself in danger. There are many who will remember you as the one who broke the seal." Nikki flinched at the touch. For a brief moment, she missed the old safety, the man who had stabilized rather than threatened. The touch then became something more, a reminder that the person alongside her possessed the ability to change outcomes in ways that made adversaries vanish. And then the decision she'd been debating like a slow burn erupted. She left the house and drove to the garage, where she stored the old items she couldn't throw away, photographs, letters, and a modest shrine to a life spent in seasons. She walked to a locked box she'd had since childhood, and within was a little revolver she'd never used. It felt weighty in her hand, like an animal. It smelt faintly of oil. She had never been violent, but she had always been determined. That night, as the Newman household fell asleep, Nikki waited in the shadowy passage outside Victor's study. She might have phoned cops from a porch. She could have handed over the USB and the accounts to a lawyer and watched the law unfold like a big, methodical beast. But certain parts of her had worn thin, the names of the fallen, the record of judgments that had left people homeless and mute. Silence has a cost. She had paid with years of accommodation. Tonight, she intended to use a different currency. Action. Victor opened the study door and looked at her as if he held the cosmos in his pocket. "Nikki," he exclaimed, his amazement almost bringing him back to life. "What is?" She didn't speak. She lifted the rifle, like a woman displaying a gem. For a brief period, the world became focused on the reflected point of metal and the faces in the desk frame. Family photographs, children, birthdays. She considered all of the ways power could render pain invisible, and she felt it all intensely and immediately. "You have to go to the police," she finally said. Her voice was sandpaper-like. I cannot let you keep making decisions about who gets to stay alive in this city." Victor's expression altered from shock to a spark of wrath so old and familiar that it felt like a species memory. "You can't be serious," he replied. She was serious. She had the files. She had the names. She had the resolve. She had loved him deeply and still cherished memories of who he had once been. But she had a list of people whose lives had been cut short, as well as a strong sense of unfairness. He approached her, a man using every charm and calculation he knew. "Nikki, don't act ridiculous. You're not required to do anything so theatrical." "Maybe I do," she said, the sentence like a sorrowful gift. Her hand was steady now. She'd been trembling in the solitude of her heart for years, and it had finally stopped. When the gun fired, it made a loud noise. Nikki felt the recoil, and the world swirled. Victor lurched backwards, as if the floor had collapsed beneath him. Blood spread across his chest like a creeping, red flame. For a brief moment, everything after the sound became a dream. Voices, a lady shouting, and the paparazzi's nightmare of public turmoil. Victor landed awkwardly on the floor. Nikki stood over him, the gun smoking in her fingers and the files scattered like confetti on the rug. She had accomplished what she had feared and seemed impossible. The reality had been a USB and a bullet, and both were now out in the open. She collapsed to her knees as sirens sounded throughout the night. Security, police, and paramedics rushed into the residence. Nick's face, when it appeared in the entryway, was ripped into a dozen lines of dread and anger. Nikki's knees buckled as paramedics compressed Victor's wound, their gaze raw and practical. "You said you'd go to the police," she told him quietly. "You created monsters out of people's lives. I couldn't see the city lose more people." Nick's hand clasped hers and squeezed like a plea. "Nikki," he whispered, his voice husky. You're not alone." Victor, in and out of consciousness, produced a raspy laugh that sounded half painful and half like an old man astonished at his vulnerability. "You always dramatize," he slurred. "Even now." But the drama was over. The files gleamed in the glaring light of the impending public interrogation. Yes, the USB had shattered Nikki, but it did so by breaking the dam that had held a river of truth underground. She had disrupted the orderly life of secrecy with a single irreversible deed. The ramifications would be catastrophic. There would be trials, yes, legal, familial, and moral. Nikki's actions would be discussed in courtrooms and on talk shows, while Victor's offenses, if proven, would transform the city. But, as the paramedics closed in on him, Nikki felt something other than victory or justification. It was a raw, exhausting calibration, She had done what she thought was right in a world where justice was frequently drowned by power. The USB lay on the rug, a little gleaming device that had transported the truth like contraband. The files would be protected, the recordings analyzed, and the guilty, if the patterns held up, brought to light. Nikki would be accused and defended, loved and despised, battered and lionized in the same word. The city would publish its own verdicts in the newspapers. But for one night, the lady who had been forced into the shadows by decades of tolerating a monster had committed the act that rewrote the ledger. Whether the world forgive is another story. Tonight's news story began with blood on the carpet, a flickering cursor on a laptop, and a thumb drive that altered everything.